Good evening, anybody. Pleased to have tonight us Stefan-Ludwig Hoffmann, who is a professor of late modern European history, right? The University of California, Berkeley. Stefan has written important essays on 19th and 20th century European history, particularly intellectual history. He has a recent book on Reinhard Koselleck's thinking. It's forthcoming. It's in German, but there is an English translation forthcoming for Princeton University. And he is a protagonist of a historical debate, also to some extent political debate on political science debate on human rights. Recently, he has particularly an important essay in the journal Past and Present, which is a very influential journal in the field of modern and contemporary history. The title of his presentation today is The History and Politics of Human Rights Before and After 1989. Stefan, please.
Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation. Yeah, Professor Pons, Professor Pianta, I'm very glad to be here in Florence at the Istituto Ciampi. And I actually received my first invitation in 2019 before the pandemic for a conference that Silvio was organizing at the Scuola Normale in Pisa. And then I couldn't come to the conference. And now, 5 years later, 6 years later, I'm here. So I'm looking forward to our discussion. I'm looking forward to the comments. Thank you both. As Professor Pons mentioned, I did write a different book during the pandemic. I was working on the book on human rights, but with the world in lockdown and in crisis, I somehow felt I should return to essays that I had written on the German theorist of history, Reinhard Koselleck, who is also a theorist of time, temporality, and crisis, and moments of rupture. So I spent a couple of years on this book, and I'm returning now to the book manuscript on human rights. So I'm very grateful also for our discussion today. But as you will see at the very end of the talk, I will actually come back to Koselleck and to how do we think about moments of rupture also in human rights history. But let me begin where my own interest in the history of human rights originated in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when human rights became what I called in 2008 at one of the first conferences on international history of human rights, a new doxa. So a particular conviction of Euro-Atlantic elites in the post-Cold War era, doxa defined by Pierre Bourdieu as those convictions of our society that are tacitly presumed to be self-evident, beyond questioning, that define the space of the morally and politically conceivable and speakable. Yeah? So there was a moment, it seems unreal now, but there was a moment in time where it felt like that human rights have a certain naturalness, self-evidence, which also meant that they didn't have a history. So historians actually began writing this history only in the 2010s. And as Professor Pons said, I was part and parcel, and many others who participated in that conference were part and parcel of that new historiography. Now, in this specific sense, human rights did become, in the late 20th century, the last utopia after the collapse of communism and anti-colonialism, as Samuel Moyn argued in a book that was published in 2010. Or to use a term by Michel Foucault and Bourdieu to describe the hidden script of power at work here, human rights became something like an episteme, a condition of possible knowledge production. Like globalization, human rights became a key concept to describe the transformations of the 2 decades around the year 2000. Entire disciplines in the social sciences and humanities were seeing an explosion of scholarship on human rights. Sociology, law, political science, international relations was basically reinvented in the human rights key. Entire new subfields of knowledge were created. If you think of comparative genocide studies, migration studies, gender and security studies, global studies, international criminal law. So many of these master programs that are in place now and that we teach students in today were actually created in the early 2000s. This is also true for human rights centers, the whole academic infrastructure. So it was something like an episteme that is still in place, I would argue, but I will come to that later. So this is the first argument or first takeaway point of my lecture today. The late 20th century, early 21st century enthusiasm for human rights, especially among European elites. So there's the difference between the US and Europe. So sometimes I will talk about Euro-Atlantic elites, but it's really, at the core, this European elites who were invested in this in this last utopia, as Moyn calls it. So historians are beginning to map out the legal, political, social, intellectual history of the last 30 or 40 years only now. Historians are, by definition, latecomers. So we always come after the fact. So we are now writing the histories of these transformations, the transformations that happened after 1989, and human rights history is part of that, new historiography. But just to remind you of the zeitgeist of the early 2000s, those of you who were not around at that time, let me give you just one quote. I could have picked anyone, but I'm using a quote by Mark Leonard, a British political scientist and co-founder of the European Council of Foreign Relations, who in 2005 published a book which was called Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century. And here's the quote from the introduction. Europe's reach, I'm quoting, is broad and deep, spreading a value system, and he names human rights, democracy, free markets, from Albania to Zambia. It draws other countries into its orbits rather than seeking to define itself against them. And as they come under the influence of its laws and customs, they are changed forever. Europe, quietly, has rediscovered within its foundations a revolutionary model for the future and an alternative to American hard power. With little fanfare, Europe has pooled the resources and the sovereignty of its nations into a radical new interface and a power that is discreetly but insistently transforming the world. Yeah, so that's kind of the vision that was articulated by many at the time, what we might call a doxa or what became an episteme. And in the age of Trump, one might almost feel nostalgic for this belief in Europe as an empire light based on the soft power of these core tenets of what I would call liberal internationalism. Free markets, the first tenet, global circulation of capital, good, and people. Other doxa, which we are criticizing today as neoliberalism. The idea of a global information and network society. So that's the second core belief in transnational NGOs, a global civil society. And then finally, individual human rights, tied to the conviction that the nation state is obsolete. Yeah? So it's not about citizenship rights, but it's about individual human rights in the writings of again, I'm just naming one, Ulrich Beck, for example, the German sociologist, who made this distinction between cosmopolitanism on the one hand, cosmopolitanism as being something of the past, Enlightenment, 18th century. But now what we are witnessing, Beck wrote in the early 2000s, is a cosmopolitization. Yeah, so it's not that we need a belief in cosmopolitanism, but it is happening anyway because of globalization. Yeah? So this breakthrough of human rights was seen as something that is a transformation in connection with globalization that is almost like a natural historical process unfolding. There were many terms coined at the time, for example, denationalization, but also deterritorialization. I don't know if some of the political scientists remember that, this idea that territory plays no role any longer in a globalized world, which seems absurd today when we have the wars in Ukraine and in Gaza. But there was once this belief that territory is obsolete. All right, so now at the moral core of this, I argue, new episteme was the belief in individual human rights that fills the ideological void left by the Cold War. Yeah, so that's the first argument I'm making tonight, and that I also made in the article that some of you have read. And what is striking is this emphasis on individual rights, not in tandem with social and collective rights, which were seen at the time as intrinsically bound to the ideological struggles of the past, of the 20th century, the ages of extremes, title of Eric Hobsbawm's book on the 20th century, published in the 90s, or of past illusions, the title of François Furet's also, book on the 20th century. So communist internationalism, anti-colonial internationalism, this is passé. The future is a form of liberal internationalism in which sovereignty itself becomes again conditional. Not conditional, not on civilization, like in international law in the 19th century. Can talk about this more in our discussion, but an adherence to human rights. So human rights in many ways replaces in international law what civilization was in the 19th century. So instead of a standard of civilization as we have it in the 19th century international law, which kind of conditioned sovereignty, we now have human rights and adherence to human rights, which conditions sovereignty. It becomes a condition for European Union membership, but since 1995, also for international cooperation and developmental aid of the European Union. Yeah? So human rights standards. And as a logical consequence of this move, some international legal scholars like Anne Peters argued that only individuals should be the subject of international law. Yeah, so she published a book in 2014, Beyond Human Rights, the Legal Status of the Individual in International Law. So that's, put to an extreme, this trend which puts all the emphasis on individual human rights and became synonymous with European integration after the end of the Cold War. So you could say it becomes more Eurocentric, and this leads me to my second point. So I'm not making a legal or normative argument here whether, for example, Anne Peters is correct. That's the business of international lawyers. What I'm arguing instead is that this embrace of human rights in the post-Cold War era made human rights more Eurocentric and in many ways created new forms of critique of human rights that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but are in fact a reaction to this, human rights enthusiasm of the 90s and 2000s. So we think that, this idea that human rights is something Eurocentric or Western, is built into human rights. But it is actually a critique that emerges only in the early 2000s, after 9/11, and also, Eurocentrism as a term becomes, gains currency in the 2000s and 2010s. Yeah? Also, this idea that something is specifically Eurocentric and often tied to human rights gains currency only then. It was around earlier, so already during decolonization, but if you do a Google Ngram search and you put in globalization, human rights, Eurocentrism, you see that globalization didn't exist as a key term until the 1990s. You will see that Eurocentrism, has a slight peak in the 1960s, but then goes down and then skyrockets in the 2010s. And human rights, has a slight peak in the 1940s, then in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but it also skyrockets only since the 1990s and 2000s. Yeah, so it's these three terms in connection. So let me just remind you, I assume most of you are familiar with this, what are the critiques of human rights that emerge in the post 9/11 era. So I will give you just a few prominent examples that in many ways initiate this backlash against human rights in which we find ourselves today. So from the left, one of the key authors is, of course, Naomi Klein, her best-selling critique of neoliberalism, shock therapy, argues that human rights NGOs are essentially silent partners of, disaster capitalism and are not, a counterweight, but because of their depoliticized nature, are not addressing the root causes of social inequality, but instead are just, operating in tandem, basically, with neoliberalism. And this critique, has been repeated by others, by Alain Badiou, Slavoj Žižek, my colleague Wendy Brown, Berkeley, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, of course, in Imperio, are making a similar argument about individual human rights as depoliticizing and as a justification for liberal interventionism. Imperio was published in 2020. And, there are many more of these books. There's a more recent book by the German philosopher, political theorist Christoph Menke, Kritik der Rechte, critique of rights. And all of these, critiques from the left follow in some ways Marx's arguments, that he had articulated in this short text on the Jewish question, that this focus on individual rights and not on social and economic conditions of humanity to enjoy these rights is, what makes human rights so ineffective, if not complicit, in global capitalism. It's a different critique. It's coming from the right in the 2000s. Interestingly, also, only in the 2000s, and not in the 1970s or 80s. So Alain de Benoit, in his book Au-delà des droits de l'homme, published in 2004, Beyond Human Rights, argues that human rights are a Western, abstract, universalist ideology focused on individual individuals above the community, which undermines traditional bonds and cohesions. And you find, similar arguments made across geographies on the right. So Alexander Dugin, to name just another prominent example, makes very similar arguments in his publications since the early 2000s, claiming that human rights are a form of Western individualism used for military interventions and global dominance. And both Benoit, but also Dugin, essentially co-opt some of the post-colonial critique, which is the third, strand of critiques that are emerging in the late 90s, early 2000s of human rights. Again, just to give you one name, perhaps, Makao Mutua, international legal scholar, born in Kenya, but then educated in the US. And actually, most of these post-colonial legal scholars who formulate these critiques of human rights teach at US law schools. So it is kind of a critique of empire within the empire. And Mutua makes the argument that not only are human rights Eurocentric, not only do they mask universalism and have at its core a Euro-American hegemony, but that they're also reframing colonial hierarchies. So seeing Western NGOs as saviors, and then the subjects of human rights activism and humanitarian aid as savages or victims. So again, the argument is also about depoliticization, that the actual conflict, the root causes, which for Mutua would be colonialism and the after effects of colonialism, are not addressed by human rights, but instead are perpetuated in a different way. All right, I'm cutting a few things here. So just to wrap up the second argument, or remind yourself of the second argument, these critiques of human rights emerge only in the early 2000s in reaction to this kind of embrace of human rights by Euro-Atlantic elites, and also by the interventionism that is happening in the late 1990s and early 2000s in a world in which the US is essentially the global hegemon. To put this differently, you would be hard-pressed to find critiques of human rights in the decades before 1989. So that might surprise you. But if you would teach a course or you put together a reader, critiques of human rights, it would begin with Edmund Burke, a conservative critique of the French Revolution and the rights of men, would continue with Marx, would lead up maybe to Carl Schmitt, the 1920s and 30s, but then you would essentially jump, or maybe Hannah Arendt, actually, who also articulated a critique of human rights and origins of totalitarianism, also seeing human rights as depoliticizing, essentially. So she's rehearsing Burke's arguments there. But then, you would jump into the 2000s and you would find actually very similar arguments that are made by these new critiques of human rights. Okay, so I've come to the third point that I want to make tonight, or the third takeaway, if you will, of the lecture. And that is that human rights were embraced before 1989 by very different political actors for very different purposes during and after decolonization, but then especially in the 1970s and 80s. So to put this bluntly, the main driver of human rights internationalism up to the late 1990s in the Cold War era was the Global South. So ironically, the only substantial critique of human rights in the 60s and 70s comes from Friedrich Hayek, the godfather of neoliberalism. And Hayek, was criticizing precisely this human rights internationalism of the post-Cold War, post-war, and then the era of decolonization, which as its main characteristic, has this expansion of human rights now to include social and economic rights, but also self-determination or independence as a human right. So Hayek writes in Law, Legislation, and Liberty, which was published in the 1970s, I quote, "The old civil rights focused on the individual could not be enforced by law without at the same time destroying the liberal order at which the old civil rights aim." So the critique of the Universal Declaration that Hayek is articulating here is that it is a fusion of non-Western and Western idea of rights, and that it merges social and economic aspirations with individual rights. What he calls an irresponsible game, because for Hayek, bringing social and economic rights in, which can only be pushed through essentially by a state, also or by a political community, will eventually erode and destroy individual rights. So that's it's a very Hayekian idea, and a critique of human rights that is worth reminding us of, because it shows us, if we turn it around, what human rights was actually standing for in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, which is that human rights internationalism was essentially a form of turning away from empire, transition from a world of empire, of European empires, to a world of nation states organized in the United Nations. And the UN itself was turned into a post-colonial institution. So just to remind you of the numbers, so in 1945, 51 nation states were members of the UN, so the moment of the founding of the UN. But then between 1955 and 1965, almost 50 former colonies entered the UN. And by 1970, the General Assembly represented 127 member states, countries. And it had already in the 1960s an inbuilt African, Asian, post-colonial majority. Yeah. So this kind of post-imperial internationalism had, two pillars. One was self-determination, independence, and the other was human rights. And not surprisingly, self-determination itself became a human right in 1960 with, the Declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples. But then also in the two covenants on civil and political rights, 1966, and in the Covenant on Social and Economic Rights, which were mainly drafted in subcommittees in the 1950s and 60s by post-colonial actors, often, without the participation, for example, of the US. And the US has not ratified the Covenant on Social and Economic Rights to this day. So human rights internationalism was essentially seen as a bulwark against the return of interventionist and extractive imperial practices. So the first article of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights says, I quote, "All peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural developments. And then the second article also states, and this is important, all peoples may, for their own ends, freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources without prejudice to any obligations arising out of international economic cooperation. Yeah, so it's also about natural resources, natural wealth that is tied to self-determination and to human rights. And as Adam Gettershow and others, political theorists, historians, have shown in the course of, building this kind of post-imperial internationalism, the meanings of human rights, but also the meanings of self-determination were essentially transformed and changed. Okay, so in the 1970s and 80s, then we have very different and competing notions of human rights coexisting at the same time. So we have this post-colonial internationalism in the UN, conferences, new covenants, new declarations that are being drafted on development, on the new international economic order, one of the proposals of the 1970s that historians are now excavating. All of these, this form of internationalism was one way in which human rights was used in the 1970s and 80s. At the same time, Western governments and also Western NGOs are discovering human rights for their own purposes. So this is what Moyne is describing as the last utopia, which begins in the 1970s, but as I argue, has its real breakthrough moment only in the 90s and 2000s because of the end of the Cold War. In the 1970s and 80s, it coexisted with very different notions of human rights. It coexisted and competed with different notions of human rights. We have, this focus on individual rights, on individual human rights that we see with, neoliberals and neocons like Hayek. But we also have an embrace of human rights language by grassroots social movements in Latin and Central America that are very differently motivated by the theology of liberation and so on. National liberation movements in Southern Africa and elsewhere are essentially reinventing themselves from, armed struggle and national liberation into human rights, or they are embracing the language of human rights as well. And the best example of that is Nelson Mandela, who, was in prison and was not recognized as a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International because he didn't disavow violence, because he believed in the end of apartheid and national liberation, and then he becomes kind of the icon of human rights in the late 80s and then after the end of apartheid in the 90s, and South Africa itself becomes kind of, some would say today a failed experiment in, human rights policies put into work. So all of this is, the main point that I'm making here. All of this changes in the years post-1989, post-Cold War. It is a particular version of human rights, essentially, a bastardized version of Hayek's understanding of human rights that becomes hegemonic in the late 90s and early 2000s, and which then is projected retrospectively onto history by contemporary critics and defenders of human rights alike. So I'm skipping, I'm happy to expand on this, on the 1990s some more in our discussion, and especially how human rights were also used then for interventions, also tied to Holocaust memory in the 90s. And then, in 1999, we see the first military deployment in NATO's history in the name of ending a genocide and in the name of human rights. The German foreign minister at the time, Joschka Fischer, who himself, was a radical in 1968, is now saying, well, yes, I am for peace, but therefore, NATO needs to bomb Belgrade. And I'm not, re-litigating now whether this was justified or not. I just want to remind you how these arguments got their potency and why this language, was so, almost overwhelming. And, this also means that, the historiography of human rights, so this is kind of an inside argument, but the historiography on human rights that emerged in the last 20 years was essentially also trying to find the genealogies of this understanding of human rights, of individual human rights. And some historians found it in new sensibilities in the 18th century and the Enlightenment, in human empathy. Others, like Moyne, found it in the late 70s with, the embrace of human rights by Jimmy Carter and Amnesty International. But in both cases, self-determination and social and economic rights were no longer part of human rights history. So they're essentially written out of that history. Okay, I come to my conclusion and would like to take a few minutes to share an episode from a novel by Jonas Lüscher, and the novel is called Kraft. Was translated into English, also in Spanish, not into Italian, unfortunately. It's a hilarious boomer story of a German professor of rhetoric and aging Reaganite. So he was, kind of a minority among the students at his time for his love for Reagan. Unhappily married, badly in debt, and the only way out of his misery is, or the way that he sees out of this misery, is that he participates in a competition to be held in California, sponsored by a Silicon Valley tycoon and techno-optimist, which is a character thinly veiled, based on Peter Thiel. So at some point, and this is only this episode that I wanted to share with you from that novel. At some point, Kraft, this main character, is taking the train from San Francisco to Palo Alto, which is also the train you would have to take if you want to go from Berkeley to Stanford. He is on this train, which is called the Caltrain, which is a diesel locomotive, essentially from the 19th century. It's kind of a silvery, shiny bullet train that is very slow and stops frequently and makes its way to Silicon Valley. And at some point, the train comes to a complete halt in between two stations, and the conductor runs through the train, and this professor complains about the delay because he wants to go to Palo Alto, and the conductor is pointing to his walkie-talkie and says, "Well, I cannot get a connection with the next station, so we cannot get the okay to continue with our journey." And then Kraft, who at that time was on his phone with his wife in Heidelberg, in Germany, and is looking around the train where everyone is on Zoom and is streaming movies, has this moment that historical theorists are describing as the contemporaneity of the non-contemporaneous. So what do we mean by that? So technology is a good example that, at the very same time, at that very same moment, We have different technologies that are still, at work. We have the diesel locomotive of the 19th century, which accelerated the 19th century, but is now slowing things down. We have the walkie-talkie as a new communication device, which was invented in the Second World War. I don't know if the students know what a walkie-talkie is, actually. And finally, we have the internet of the 90s and 2000s, and both coexist, and collide at the very same moment. Now, this is, and this is, my conclusion, is also a way in which I would suggest we should think about the history and politics of human rights. So, we are not at a moment in which human rights are disappearing, vanishing. We had this discussion before our event today. It's clearly not a moment any longer where, we have this belief in its, infinite progression. So it's neither, this teleology of progress, nor is it necessarily a cyclical model of rise and fall. And instead, it's this kind of coexistence and collisions also of different notions and institutions of human rights at the very same moment. What the historian Rainer Koselleck describes as sediments of time. So different sedimentations of time that are existing at the very same moment. And essentially, if we want to understand our moment, we have, like geologists, have to drill down in these different geological layers. So if we are drilling down, so to speak, and look at human rights at the present moment, there can be no doubt that this question of self-determination and whether self-determination is a human right, which essentially is a late 18th, 19th century connex. The rights of man were used in the American revolutions, but also in Haiti and elsewhere, as to explain the breakaway from empire, to justify self-determination. And in the catastrophic wars in Ukraine and Gaza, we have something similar going on there, undoubtedly, whatever else ideologically is happening. But these are wars of independence from foreign rule and against a new form of imperial power politics in a now multipolar world in which sovereignty has become, again, conditional. So at the deepest level, human rights are not only about empathy with distant suffering, as Lynn Hunt would argue, but are a political device to make rights claims. And the most important right is the right to political agency, what Hannah Arendt called the right to have rights. Yes, the right to political agency, the right to self-determination is, at the center of human rights, at least, in this, at this deepest level, I would say. And when we look at these conflicts today, and we have this sense of déjà vu, or we've seen this before, or is our time moving backwards? Well, this is precisely the reason, because it activates a political problem that is still operative in our world today, in which some peoples are denied, their right to self-determination. Now, another historical sediment, and you could add many more, I'm just giving you three, that coexist in our time, is the rules-based UN human rights internationalism that was, built first post-1945, but then, as I have shown to you today, then expanded dramatically in the 1960s against empire, and was not dominated by Europe or the US. And in some ways, if we look at the international organizations, courts, conferences that continue to meet. They don't disappear. They don't vanish. Just last week, we had the UN Climate Change Conference in Belém, and even if the US doesn't send representatives anymore to these conferences, this internationalism is still at work. It's not gone, which also means that it is a condition of possibility for the future. And finally, as another layer or sediment of time, the human rights work of NGOs has changed dramatically from the 1970s and 80s to our time. So the argument that they are depoliticizing can no longer be made. On the contrary, Amnesty International was attacked for its report, The Crime of Apartheid on Israel, and so on. So in our world today, these NGOs are indispensable, for example, to document war crimes, genocides, or human rights violations. If you think of the organization Menmonic, which has the Syrian archive, the Yemeni archive, the Sudanese archive, the Ukrainian archive, or I.L. Weizmann's Forensic Architecture organization, which is documenting crimes against humanity in Gaza. But in all of these, archives and what these NGOs are doing is essentially collecting the hours of footage on social media which document human rights violations, and so many hours of footage from social media documenting human rights abuses are stored on these platforms that one person cannot watch them in a lifetime. So they are essentially using now artificial intelligence and also to protect those who have to watch all of this footage, to identify war crimes, crimes against humanity in social media that is uploaded on these platforms, is stored there, and is collected in the hope to bring these to international courts someday. And even though we don't know whether this moment will ever come, it's pretty clear to me that this kind of human rights work is more important than ever. So thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to the comments.
Thank you, Stefan. So let's ask first discussant Michaela Frulli, Università di Firenze, to please.
First of all, let me thank the Scuola Normale Superiore and the Istituto Ciampi for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here, and also thank Professor Hoffmann for the paper that I read and also for the presentation today. As I was telling to him right before we started, it's a lot to process. It's very deep. I mean, there's so much in the paper and also in what he told us today that it's somehow difficult to react, because I have a lot going on in my mind. So I will try to give some reflections, but thank you, because you really gave me a lot to think about, and I will continue to do so after today. And I will try also to be a little bit exaggerated in the arguments that I will make. But basically, I will not really discuss your paper or your presentation because I totally agree with you. So I will try to make some reflections from the point of view of a legal scholar. So you said already also tonight, you told us about human rights being the doxa of our time, and also in the paper, but also I think in your speech, you warn us about being a myopic vision or historiography that just celebrates a little bit the triumph of human rights and the breakthroughs. And I was really particularly, I mean, the one thing that really struck me was the comparison with not only the comparison, but I would add the uncomfortable resemblance to the 19th century dynamics, civilized versus uncivilized. So that one was one thing that really made me think a lot. So what I would like to do is to take off from where you left and to apply your reasoning to the crisis of international law that we are seeing today. And in fact, in light of what you said, and again, looking backwards, it seems that this breakthrough and this triumph, let's say this doxa that emerged in the 1990s, somewhat was not a step forward for the rule of law. What do I want to say? It seems that somehow it triggered a regression, in fact, because it marked the moment, this moment in which you say it becomes a universal doctrine, when international law, using this humanitarian shield, humanitarian cover, coupled, I would add, with the anti-terrorist arguments, began to drift away from the strict prohibition of the use of force that was at the center of the post-World War II order, and started sliding back toward, I would say, a pre-modern concept of bellum justum, of just war, of moral war, even, you know, and also, again, leaving room and justifications for double standards, for selectivity. If we look at this ethical turn, as you called, I mean, Koskaniemi also and other have talked about this ethical turn, the end of history and all, you know, the narrative that was ongoing. It seems like the moment when finally human rights become enforceable in the 1990s. But in fact, the UN Charter in 1945 was built around the idea of maintenance of peace and security much more than on human rights. Of course, human rights is in the Charter. Also self-determination is in the Charter. But of course, it's not intended as we intend them today, because it was a colonial word, of course, in 1945, and you could not really speak of human rights yet at the international level. So the Charter established a system based on sovereign equality of states, a very strict prohibition of the use of force as the cornerstone of the system, with the only exception of self-defense and actions authorized by the Security Council, or, you know, later on, you know, there were the self-determination, national liberation struggles, but they were not there at the moment. Later on, in fact, international law developed in the sense of allowing the use of force to gain national independence or to, you know, to defy a racial regime, but it was not there at the beginning. So self-determination was there, but was not there at the beginning. It comes at a later stage into the picture. But in the 1990s, under the banner of humanitarian intervention, again, I would add under the banner of anti-terrorism struggle and protection of human rights, we saw the shift. So the priority apparently moved from protecting peace to that was somewhat taken for granted. But peace was already there. In the 90s, you don't speak about, you know, the war, it's not there. You know, it's like, at least not in Europe. We you know, it's far away from our horizon. And so we shift to enforcing human rights, but with very selective humanitarian interventions authorized by the Security Council in a very ineffective way, because you mentioned also in the paper the tragedies of former Yugoslavia, the tragedy of Rwanda, I would add Somalia, and we, you know, eventually arriving at the NATO bombing campaign without any authorization by the UN Security Council, but clearly labeled as humanitarian, paving the way for armed intervention against Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003 that were not labeled as humanitarian purely, let's say, more as anti-terrorist, again, interventions. But again, the human rights idea was always there, no, because it was, you know, and again, this bringing civilization to these barbaric people that use terrorism as, you know, the main way of fighting. So this shift that may sound noble, in fact, predictably opened a Pandora's box from the point of view of, you know, going along a slippery slope. We began to hear arguments about the fact that sovereignty is no longer absolute. Military force can and should be used, as you were saying also today, to protect human rights. And this is, of course, is an historical problem, but it's also a legal dilemma, I would say. And again, it brings us back to the idea of a just war that I think it's really, really dangerous. And, you know, in my ears, I have the idea of moral armies and this kind of thing that I think has nothing to do with international law. And this attitude eventually led, as you did not mention tonight, but you mentioned in your writings, to the doctrine of R2P, of responsibility to protect, which, however, never became an international customary rule, and eventually refers to the possibility of an authorization by the Security Council to have a humanitarian intervention. So at the end, you stay in the same scenario from the point of view of the possibility to use force, and again, you rely on the Security Council, which is a political body and which is very selective by its nature, as we see nowadays. But you know, it was always, of course, a political body. In addition, I think that the rhetoric of human rights and the fight against terrorism at the international level, in fact, led to a significant compression of fundamental rights in domestic legal systems. Paradoxal, it's a paradox. This trend points towards a reinforcement of traditional sovereignty. You were saying it very well tonight. So on one hand, you say we have a different kind of sovereignty, a responsible sovereign that is intervening for the protection of human rights, especially even abroad. If they are not able to protect the fundamental rights of the people, we are going to intervene. But then, in order to do so, in fact, you limit the fundamental rights of your citizens, of your residents, of your people, for national security reasons. So for the most sovereign, with the most sovereign argument, let's say, a sort of invented mirror with the idea of intervening for humanitarian reasons to uphold human rights and combat terrorism abroad, and then significantly limiting human rights in the very same countries that are intervening abroad. And again, I see a lot of your point about civilization against the civilized versus uncivilized people. This brings me quickly, because I want to leave time for Chiara, to the rise and crisis also of the international criminal justice. Now, I've told this to you before, but I want to be clear. I think that the establishment of criminal tribunals, eventually the creation of the International Criminal Court, are positive, genuinely positive efforts to pursue individual criminal liability for international crimes. I'm not talking about the origins of this idea, but the notion that individuals, including leaders, must be responsible for the gravest violations of international law is a very important achievement. So I'm convinced, let's say, about the importance of this instrument, but we cannot ignore how international criminal justice has been functioning, while the institutions, I believe, are nowadays, at least, impartial or mostly impartial, the political will that activates them and the will of states to cooperate with them, and they rely on on states because they are not supranational bodies in the real sense. They need police forces from the states, institutions, cooperation by states. And if we look back, we see, for instance, that the prosecutor of the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, decided to close the investigation into potential war crimes committed by NATO officials during the 1999 bombing campaign that you were mentioning against Serbia. The ICC prosecutor has deprioritized investigation on Afghanistan, not the investigations on the crimes committed by the Taliban, but on potential crimes committed by Western troops, by British troops, just to give a couple of examples. And for many years, many of you will know that there was the idea of the African court, that the ICC was only going after African criminals. And there was even a very serious crisis with the threat of mass withdrawal from the court by African states at one point. And I think the age of double standards we saw when we saw the unconditional support of Western states to the activity of the ICC, I think rightly so, when it was investigating crimes committed by Russians in Ukraine. But at the same time, we saw profound criticism investing the court when investigations turned to what was happening in Gaza and to the responsibility of Israeli leaders. So here again, we had, and this is, I don't know, something I would like to hear you about, because here I think we have maybe a different point of view between Europeans and the US about Ukraine, but not about Israel, because in light of this heavy sanctions that the US administrations adopted against the court, against the prosecutor and 9 judges, the Europe just did nothing. There was no reaction about this. I will skip the failure to cooperate by Italy, which is a shame.
Yes, 1 minute, please.
Yes. I just close with this thing that I want to say, and then maybe we can come back. One thing that is in the paper is the use that you make, that you underline about the category of genocide and the memory of the Holocaust. You stress a lot in the paper that these arguments were used as triggers to induce empathy also, but also to emphasize the triumph of human rights and the need to justify humanitarian interventions. And I would say that the instrumentalizations of genocide allowed the civilized world to intervene against the barbarians again. But then today we see again an inverted mirror. It's the other way around. Should we see that genocide has become the taboo word, and notwithstanding the provisional measures ordered by International Court of Justice, countless legal documents asserting that we have a genocide, then Western states are still denying these European states in the first place, because of course, if they admit that there is a possible genocide, not only there are legal obligations stemming from the convention, also the obligation to prevent that concern all states, but then they should, to be consistent, say that it is possible to have a military intervention against Israel to stop the campaign in Gaza. So I'm not going into more details, but I think I agree with your conclusion that we cannot, of course, only look at the darkest side of the pictures. So we have to see also the different layers, as you say. And I think over the last 80 years, precisely, there's a lot that has been built. For instance, within the UN, all the treaty bodies, all the organs that we have, and that are not only a place where individuals can claim their rights, but also places where minority groups or, indigenous people were able to claim their rights. And also the regional systems, the European regional system, the Inter-American, the African system, that did a lot to advance human rights, not only, I would say, individual rights, but also in some instances, especially in the Inter-American system, collective rights. So now we see, again, I think, a very interesting movement by the Global South in trying to use international courts and tribunals or to uphold international law arguments to counterbalance this Western hegemonic interpretation, I would say, distortion of human rights. So I think we have to cling on that at least to resist looking at that. Thank you.
You. Now, Chiara Milan, Scuola Normale Superiore, please.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to read your paper, and thanks for the presentation, and also for the invitation to discuss. I'm particularly, I come from sociology, so we'll provide a bit of a sociological your paper. However, I have to say that personally, I was one of the first generation, I think, shaped by this human rights rhetoric, because I studied at the University of Padova, where there is also now rights. And I have to say that now, coming back to the topic after 20 years, it is interesting to see how, as you mentioned, historians started to write the history of human rights only in the late 2010. So interesting because back then, I think, well, I was younger, and also there was no criticism of the idea of human rights, and there was not even an history of human rights. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to reflect upon this. And for the comprehensive account of the historiography of human rights, that is your paper. Also, it is difficult not to agree with you, of course, especially when you start asking who is opposed to human rights today. Well, nobody. But then I really like the analysis. However, I have some point of, I disagree, for instance, in this attempt to look only at the post-1989 world as the period in which human rights became, as you mentioned, universal moral grammar for global politics. As I think it risks somehow underplaying the transformation that came before from the 70s, I think, of the Helsinki process. I studied, I'm interested in what happens in Eastern Europe, so I think it is really a pity not to look at the moral commitment of human rights that came with the Helsinki process, and also the possibility for Eastern European dissidents to hold the government accountable, especially because in former Yugoslavia, for instance, Helsinki groups still continuing the tradition of what happened in the 70s. So, I think there is a point of criticism in looking at the post-1989. Also because when we look at human rights, as you mentioned, the intervention against Serbia, more than enforcement of human rights, it is humanitarian intervention that was masking geopolitical goals. And also, I think it was one of the moments in which the power asymmetry and Eurocentrism became particularly evident, meaning that the attack on Serbia was also somehow, not explicitly, but somehow there was a subtle idea underneath that Yugoslavia was an uncivilized world, especially this rhetoric of ethnic hatred that you mentioned, underscore the fact that the humanitarian intervention was not done in the name of human rights, but more against the country that was considered uncivilized and somehow disregarding the Yugoslav experience. And also, it shows the lack of knowledge of the Yugoslav context. As you mentioned, the attack against the Albanian population in Kosovo hardened even after the attack of the NATO. Also, I found interesting when you mentioned that humanitarian empathy is replacing rights claims, because, I mean, studying the claims of the refugee solidarity movements, I buy the arguments, and I agree with what you say. And also, Fassan is saying about the medicalization of asylum. There is another scholar, Dictin, who talks about medical humanitarianism. This is something that we see while looking at the concept of vulnerability. Now refugees need to prove they are vulnerable, and this provokes a distortion towards those who are able to prove on medical basis their vulnerability. So probably there is also a need to shift the discourse towards political claims. I mean, in Italy, there is still the possibility to lodge an asylum claim on political grounds, so to be granted refugee status. But I can see the imbalance that you mentioned between the medicalization of asylum and this idea of humanitarian empathy instead of rights claims. And I think this is somehow showing how the discourse on human rights is somehow vanishing its potential. About human rights being the last utopia, also I think I don't agree totally, because there are other utopias now. You mentioned before the climate conference in Belen, so I think the the climate justice movement is somehow creating a new utopia, or those struggling for the rights of refugees. So the freedom of movement is another utopia that's, well, a part of the population is trying to endorse and bring forth. You mentioned also, I mean, not in your paper, but now in your presentation, how NGOs are far from being depoliticized. If I think about the NGOs that are engaged in the search and rescue operation in the Mediterranean Sea, and they are being attacked for this reason, they are far from being depoliticized. Yeah, not only Amnesty, but there are, for instance, Doctors Without Borders that decided to engage into an operation like the search and rescue operations that is becoming highly politicized, I think, in Europe, at least in Italy. So I want to end with a question to you. That is, so if you have to explain in which phase we are now, also building on what Professor Frulli said, in a time in which we are witnessing a genocide and there is no action, and even there is, I mean, this violation of human rights, it's evident, but for years it has been not pointed at. There was no call for humanitarian intervention in Gaza, and there is, again, attempts to not calling for an intervention against Israel. In which phase are we of human rights? You quote in your paper that at the end of the 90s as regarded that human rights being as the bare human minimum, but I think we are way behind of the granting the bare human minimum of human rights, given that we are witnessing a genocide. So if you have to look as an historian to the phase we are living now, how would you term it? I would be curious. Thank you.
Thank you. Before giving back the floor to our speaker, I just ask if there is someone who wants to ask a very short question, because we are short of time. Yeah. Oh, yes.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. Very interesting presentation. I haven't read the paper, but I will read it with great interest. I'm trying to digest this presentation with my work. I work on political violence, social movements, and I want to ask you like a sort of provocative question that somehow goes in lines with different direction, but is not so far from what Chiara was asking. Social scientists working on revolution nowadays are discussing how contemporary revolutions have from the 1980s and particularly from 1989 shifted from the near disappearance of socialist revolution toward the growing of civic resistance. And the kind of discussion that emerges in those in that field of revolutionary studies seems to go quite in line with what you were like looking at, pointing at the development of the human rights framework and how it has developed, and now how it is somehow like under threat or like in somehow in a possible difficulty. So my provocative question would be: would you think that with because now like the fear is like the fear of human rights, that framework being like possibly like in a critical situation with the contemporary contest, but is the failure or like the challenge to the human rights framework a new possibility for a socialist revolution to reappear in the contemporary contest?
We collect all intervention, so please, who comes? Very shortly, please.
I'll try my best. Thank you. I found it very interesting, the observation that Professor Frulli made about how paradoxically, in an era where human rights was the doxa in terms of international relations and how conflicts between states would be governed, there was a strong limitation precisely in order to justify and facilitate those interventions that would then be connected to this idea of very expansive kind of human rights to limit domestically human rights in Western, liberal advanced democracies. In an era where I think there's a consensus that this is no longer really the case so much, where there's a return of kind of raison d'etat as really a justification for governing relations between states, there is, interestingly, paradoxically, amongst the critics of human rights as a concept that emerged in that period from the right, a growing kind of, I wouldn't call it a scholarly consensus because it hasn't quite been scholarly justified, but certainly a political praxis of expanding or utilizing the tools to defend human rights and civil rights that exist domestically in favor of politically selected groups in order to oppress other groups as well. With regards to the war in Gaza, it's very interesting to note how despite the many decades of criticism of the concept of human rights from the point of view of a revindication of Straussian concept of natural right that is visible in the United States, specifically with the intellectuals close to the Trump administration that come from Professor Hoffmann's California in the Claremont Institute, how those very same thinkers that have for many decades been involved in a very deep critique of the concept of human rights in favor of natural right, which is of course very different, been very enthusiastically embracing the Trump administration's drastic expansion or reutilization of the use of the domestic kind of civil rights state that was built in the aftermath of the struggles of the 1960s in order to defend and alleged cases of anti-Semitism would perhaps be the most neutral way to put it on American college campuses and in American society writ large. How would you evaluate this kind of reinterpretation of human rights in a domestic context, and cynical manipulation would perhaps be a very biased way to put it, but certainly reevaluation, at least in praxis, if not intellectually, of the various kind of institutions that took part in organizing or mobilizing this doxa. Thank you.
Okay, I try to be quick. First of all, thanks for the very inspiring talk. We kind of all grew up as human rights enthusiasts, so this reflects very much our own intellectual history, not only Chiara Milan, but also 10 years earlier when I was doing my PhD. But I'm still a little bit confused here if I try to reposition myself now with regard to human rights, with these very different lines of critique that you kind of pointed out. One is a kind of intrinsic critique, which simply says we need to be aware of abuses of human rights discourse, like this critique of human rights interventionism. Then there is a critique which is more conceptual, which is saying that we should get rid of this idea of individual autonomy and individual rights and look at other forms of emancipation. So there is still progress, but not based on individual human rights. This is a kind of anti-Kantian critique, I would call it. And then there is a third critique, which is very fundamental and radical, which is the one of Eurocentrism, which seems to target the idea of human rights universalism and replace it by some idea of human rights relativism, and then often ends up in the defense of authoritarian forms of government. And what puzzles is the simultaneous use of these different lines of critique. So I'm probably not the only one who is confused, but also the activists are often confused in the sense that, for instance, they criticize human rights interventionism as based on Eurocentrism, and then at the same time they are propagating self-determination and emancipation. So you find this very often. So I just wonder how we get. How do we get out of this conundrum? And do you think that that a return to political theory would be useful at this point? So we need to go back to normative political theory and simply rediscuss the very relationship between human rights and democracy. Can we have democracy without human rights, or can we have human rights without democracy?
Okay, so I think we can, well, Stefan, I will keep my questions for our seminar in Pisa. So, only very briefly one point because of.
It's my pleasure.
Oh, I'm sorry, please.
I have my privilege. I have a privilege to be present in this conference this evening, which is a very important international topic because human rights matter. We are human beings. So I am professor of Niger Delta scholars. I'm a writer of Niger Delta because that's the place I come from Nigeria. So as a matter of fact, we are living in a complex society where I know sometimes, especially in Africa, human rights appears to be deprived. And the question is this: problems leading to that maybe because of weakness of the person oppressed, and the weakness or the difficulties surrounding makes one not to, declare well, and it becomes like a thing that at the end, the human right is not effectively functioning in part of the world. Why? That of our home, like Africa, we need messengers of peace, which I represent. I'm a leader of Messengers of Peace International Organization. It's an UNLUS. It's an NGO that has been founded here, constituted in this country for the past 25 years. We are looking for support to effectively improve means of humanity and the defense of the environment of Africa. So this is why I'm here. My name is Theodore Amanfo. I'm a geologist, and I studied in this country, PhD in geochemistry from the university. Very glad to be present with you guys. Thank you very much. That is anything to do, we would be very much appreciative too.
Okay, Stefan, please go ahead.
All right. So I will probably not be able to answer all the questions, but maybe I begin with your questions and I end with the comments. So, I mean, most of the questions that came from the audience were not questions to a historian, which I completely understand that you are more interested in our present moment than what historians can actually tell you. But so I can, I have opinions and I'm happy to share my opinions, but I don't have a historically, my answers are not necessarily based on historical research. But my observation in response to your question about revolution would be that and I'm seeing this also in teaching. So I teach a large lecture course at Berkeley every fall on the history and practice of human rights. I always ask students in the first week so before I get to know them, and it's a few hundred students, and I ask them to fill out on a small index card, what are human rights and what are for you the most important human rights? And in the last, 13, 12 years or so, 12, 13 years that I'm teaching this now at Berkeley, this has very much changed. And the change, and I think a name that encapsulates this change is Zoran Mamdani. So if you look, who's using the language of human rights in the context of US politics today, and this in part also answers your question, it is actually, the socialist democratic left that is now again embracing a language of human rights. And what Mamdani means by that, and what also the students, most of the students write down, are the right to healthcare, the right to housing, human right to housing, the human right to shelter. So all of, essentially social and economic rights, which, are lacking in their lives. So, I don't know if that, amounts to a revolution. But it's interesting. I mean, it speaks also to a point that you've made, that one could almost say that the overuse of the language of human rights, the hypocrisy that was at times connected to it by the West and by liberal elites, has this paradoxical effect that now they are not using it as much anymore, if at all. They are certainly not using it in foreign policy anymore. The US is not talking about human rights. US foreign policy is not talking about human rights any longer, which kind of frees that vocabulary and what is connected to it, including the history that is connected to it, up to other political purposes. So that's the only observation. And what I wanted to show with these layers is this idea, that these things don't go away, but they are, potentialities at any given moment. So that's essentially what historians can show you, that, these things did exist and they don't go completely away. And that also, applies to your question, Hans-Jörg. So yes, I mean, maybe, a new normative concept could fix all the critiques that I have just rehearsed, right? I mean, this was not my critique necessarily, but I was just trying to systematize, what were the critiques against human rights that in some ways led to also in part to this backlash and this erosion in human rights as a belief system. And yes, I'm sure that, and I guess that, some political theorists, I mean, for example, Adam Gettershu, who I mentioned, who teaches in Chicago, is someone who, was thinking through the concept of self-determination. That's why I referenced it also several times, and also in connection to human rights, and rethinking also on the normative level what self-determination means, and that it doesn't necessarily need to end in a nation state, but that especially in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, other models of political organization in the moment of decolonization were on the table, which fulfilled or kept this promise of self-determination, but didn't necessarily buy into this logic that there has to be a transition from empire to nation state, with all the complications that then a nation state creates, with questions of minority protection and so on and so on. So yeah, I do think that we see possibly a resurgence of this language of human rights, and also of NGOs that are using human rights in a more capacious way. And I'm sure your organization is part of this. And it does, so this already leads to Chiara Malan's question. So all these different utopias that you mentioned, so climate justice as one utopia, freedom of movement, search and rescue operations, or the right to asylum, all of these were actually tied to the language of human rights in the last 10, 20 years. So the right to asylum, to stay with this example, is another case where we can see, this kind of human rights, how human rights transformed legal and political instruments in international law. I mean, that the right to asylum did become a human right at all happened, only a few years ago. Essentially, it's part in the European context, at least. It was part of the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights that made the right to asylum into a human right, and we are now in this situation where we have European law that protects the right to asylum as a human right, and at the same time we have the states within the European Union that are trying to change, its status as human rights, and revert to an earlier understanding of what the right to asylum meant, namely an international agreement that yes, people can leave and can apply for asylum, but states don't have to grant asylum necessarily. And that is, what the Geneva Convention entails. So the right to asylum is actually a very good example, both for how much of that energy of the last utopia went into human rights activism, but at the same time also for what we were just talking earlier, how this has become more politicized and has become part of political activism in a way that is very different to the things that I have described for the 90s and 2000s. And then Maybe we have 5 more minutes, or maybe just on Helsinki, and this builds the bridge to Michaela Fruli's comment. So the Helsinki Accords and the Helsinki process was termed in the 1990s as a human rights revolution, as you know. And there's this famous book, The Helsinki Effect, which essentially argues that, you know, individual human rights were smuggled into the third basket of the Helsinki Accords, and this led to the downfall and you know, bit of a caricature, but you know, that is the core of the argument. So it was smuggled into the third basket, and this led to, you know, the collapse of communism, essentially. And this is a narrative that was created in the 90s to give the Helsinki process a completely different meaning to the one that it had at the time, which was exactly what Michaela was saying. It was, you know, an idea of internationalism built on peace and security. That's why, you know, the Soviet Union agreed to all of this. That's why they were at the conference table. And the dissidents that did then, you know, gesture to the third basket and to human rights provisions, because one has to ask the question, why did the Soviet Union agree to this in the first place? Well, they agreed to it because they thought this stays on the level of international, you know, treaties and international, this kind of internationalism. The dissidents, you know, didn't necessarily need Helsinki because the constitutions in the Soviet Union, in Czechoslovakia, in East Germany, and so on, they all had human rights actually in their constitutions, which is something that the West, you know, forgets. And you know, many of these dissident groups actually start by saying, well, we want those rights that are granted to us according to the socialist constitutions. This is how the opposition starts in the Soviet Union and in other places. So there is not this contradiction between human rights on the one hand and, you know, these socialist states on the other hand. On the contrary, you know, along the lines of what I said earlier, those, you know, who believed themselves to be socialists in the 1970s would think that human rights was actually on their side. Anyway, so, but this idea that Michaela, you reminded us of, you know, that essentially, you know, that we have to, I think you used the metaphor of the inverted mirror, that in some ways, you know, interventionism in the name of human rights paradoxically led to the compression of rights within states. I think that's a very lucid observation and kind of explains also why we are in the situation that we are in. And the question that was tied to this, and Chiara also asked this, so where are we now? I think, you know, that in terms of international criminal law, yes, I agree, you know, that it is sobering to see how the US essentially completely checked out of international criminal law, even though, and criminal justice, even though, you know, it is still taught at law schools. At Berkeley Law, you know, you take courses in international criminal justice, even though, you know, the lawyers that are trained there will not be able to work with the International Criminal Court. So it's a paradoxical situation, but it is also kind of the definition of empire, that you subjugate everyone else under rules that you yourself don't have to follow, right? And that's what the US did after 1918. You know, the US founded the League of Nations and then immediately checked out. And in some ways, the same happened after 1945, that the US, helped to bring into the world. And then, as I have showed you today, essentially checked out at the moment when it no longer dominated the UN. And it did the same in the late 90s with the International Criminal Court and with the International Criminal Justice that, it set up these rules for everyone. And then, as you said, it was first a couple of African states that were, or African leaders that were put on trial at the International Criminal Court. So it is this paradoxical situation in which we are now, that the lack of support for international institutions, not only in the US, but even in European countries, there is a certain hesitation, and I see this especially in the German case. Germany was so much a believer in a rules-based international order, and now, at every step, it is quite painful, and a lot of discussions within the German public are around precisely this question, or this paradox that if we take the rules-based order seriously, then we essentially step outside our military political alliances. And if we don't take it seriously, we kind of erode not only human rights, but essentially what are the moral and political foundations of Germany after Nazism. So it's an interesting time to live in, and to see all of these debates. And I think this is where we are now. Yeah.
Well, it was a great discussion. So thank you very much. Thank you to Stefan-Ludwig Hoffmann and to all other participants in the debate. And we have a seminar in Pisa on the 10th of December, 11 to 13. So there will be an announcement of it, of course. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.